Good afternoon and welcome to all of you. We really appreciate you coming here for the Media Projects grant webinar. I'm David Weinstein. I'm a program officer, and I am here with another program officer, Chrissy Cortina.
Hello. That's all. Hello.
Thanks, Chrissy. We want to welcome you, and our focus today will be on funding to produce documentary films, radio programs, and podcasts. We will leave plenty of time for questions at the end. First, I'd like to go over a few technical matters. If you have any questions or you need to contact us for technical issues during the meeting, use the Q&A for that, and there should be an icon for that on the upper right of your screen. So do not use chat, use Q&A, please. We have captioning available, and there's a CC button on the lower right corner, and the setting for captioning next to that icon. And this webinar will be recorded and posted on the website where you all found this link on the Media Projects website in around a week or so, give or take. So you can see it there. We've crammed about 20 minutes of information into the formal presentation, which I'll be delivering. Then Chrissy and I will take questions after that presentation. So again, it'll be hopefully an informative 20 minutes. We're going to go over a lot of information and then take questions. And we have a little outline now. We're going to start by talking very broadly about the NEH and the Division of Public Programs. The Division of Public Programs is the division that funds media projects. Then I'm going to talk more specifically about media projects and the media program. I'm going to tell you some things that are new about in media this year and give you some tips for applying. And again, then we'll leave some time for questions. So let's start with a super brief overview of the NEH, who we are and what we do. The NEH is the National Endowment for the Humanities. We are a federal government agency, and we were established in 1965. So these are your federal tax dollars at work as we make grants and as we make our decisions. Our chair is Shelley Lowe, who is a citizen of the Navajo Nation and a former member of our National Council. And a lot of times people ask, what are the humanities? And our website has a great deal of information, NEH.gov, on that. The short version is we define humanities largely the way a college or a university might in an arts and humanities college, for example. So we define the humanities by a couple things. We define it by a discipline or approach to a subject. Examples of humanities disciplines might be history, literature, philosophy, art history, media studies. And we also emphasize the role of scholarship in the humanities. And I'll talk a little bit more about that when talking about the media program of what we expect in terms of humanities scholarship. But research and scholarship is really central to the NEH's mission, and it's central to the media program. I should mention that there are many humanities disciplines, but in the media program, we tend to fund films that are mostly historical documentaries, even though the humanities are broader. We also fund podcasts and radio programs, and the podcasts tend to have broader subject matter. Some of them are historical, but we also, for example, have funded philosophy podcasts, linguistics podcasts, music podcasts, and all of those are humanities subjects, but we really have a niche in film with historical documentary. The Division of Public Programs, which again is our division and the division that funds media projects, film and radio and audio projects. Division of Public Programs is one of 7 NEH divisions. And the NEH tends to organize itself by the grant product, scholarly books, archival collections that are coded, for example, made accessible to the public, the product, but also the audience, scholars, for example, educators. Our audience is the public, and for public programs, we're really trying to bring some of the scholarship, including scholarship that may have been funded by other divisions, to broad public audiences, and that's really central to our mission. We accomplish this mission through a range of grant programs. We have 3. Digital projects for the public, and the deadline for that is next month. And those are for primarily quote-born digital projects. And I listed a number of the different formats: websites, mobile apps, tours, games, virtual reality, augmented reality. All of those types of projects go to digital projects for the public. We have also long funded museum projects through public humanities projects, museum exhibitions, interpretations of historic places, historic houses, historic sites. And also more recently, we fund a range of broad humanities discussion programs through public humanities projects. And finally, the grant program that we're going to be focusing on today is media projects. We fund short documentaries, long documentaries, single programs, series, all kinds of radio programs, podcasts. We fund related digital projects. So if the main product is a film or a radio program and you want to do a website to go along with it, we would fund that through media. And we fund every stage from development through production, through distribution and engagement. But as I'll discuss in a little while, if a film is complete or if a radio program is complete, we generally do not fund only distribution or only engagement. We require some production or post-production to be involved. The Media Projects program has 2 levels of funding: development and production. And when you apply, you choose one of those levels. And what we're trying to do is help media producers go from earlier development to later development. A lot of times it's hard to decide whether to apply for production or development. As I'll discuss, they have different funding levels, different amounts of money, and slightly different requirements. But a general rule is the further along you are, or the more money that you're requesting, the further along you need to be, and the more information that we need. You do not need to have applied for or received development to apply for production. You can come in directly for production. So let's move on to discuss the particular funding levels. And yeah, for production, as I mentioned, we fund production of a film, editing, distribution, and outreach and distribution as part of a production request, but not as a standalone request just for that. So the first sort of section of the media projects grant, so the first option is to apply for development. And I'll go through some of the prerequisites and what they mean, but it's important to remember that even for development, you need a good amount of information up front. And the more information that you have, the better. Sometimes filmmakers, for example, would have already started to do some interviews and to do a significant amount of work on a project, and they worry about being overqualified for development. And I suggest that you not worry about that, or if you've done some work, it still might be more appropriate for you to come in for development than production, because the application does require a significant amount of work. It's not enough to just have an idea for a film. You really need to have done some research and be able to articulate some of the ideas from the project in the NEH proposal. One of the things that we're looking at is looking for our humanities themes, and that's something that NEH requires that most other media funders do not. So I wanted to talk a little bit about what we mean by humanities themes. Humanities themes are ideas about the humanities that viewers or listeners will learn from your project. Generally, a project might have, let's say, 3 or 4 themes, even though there might be more, might be less. And they're general ideas about, again, what people will learn, and also how you're using scholarship in your project and how it's humanities scholarship. We have a number of samples of successful proposals online, and The best way to really understand what we mean by humanities themes is to look at those sample proposals and see how people develop those humanities themes. We also require a work sample. And that's a little bit of a confusing term because what we really want is a sample of previous work, not necessarily a work in progress. And that's because the experience of the media team is very important in the NEH application. We generally fund at least somewhat experienced filmmakers who are part of a team. A lot of times filmmakers will less experienced filmmakers will partner with filmmakers who are more experienced, or audio producers or podcast producers will partner with more experienced person and create a team. So that's one way of managing that if you're not super experienced. We really do try to make a lot of information about the program available. And on our website, you can get a list of recent projects that we funded. And that's really the best way to get a sense of the level of experience, not only that we're looking for, but you will be competing against when you put forward an NEH application. We also require scholarly teams. And what we mean by that is advisors who are scholars, usually affiliated with universities, who can really make sure that the project is presenting the best scholarship, the best ideas, and can help you maybe see your subject from different perspectives and brainstorm and give you some ideas about where to take the project. You can certainly have advisors who aren't affiliated with universities, aren't academics, but we do require scholarly advisors in addition to those advisors. The goal of a development grant is really to help you move closer to production, and I bulleted a number of typical activities that would be conducted during a development grant. Sometimes receiving a development grant will help you receive other funds. Sometimes it'll help you prepare a production grant. It'll allow you to accomplish a lot of the early to mid-level work in terms of producing a film, doing pre-interviews, starting to shoot interviews, even creating a fundraising trailer or work in progress, maybe hiring a writer to script a project. So all of that can be done under a development grant. Production grants are our biggest money grants, and they're for up to $700,000. The prerequisites are not that different for development and production, but we require a lot more polish, a lot more work to have been done to truly be competitive at production. We require treatments or scripts in both development and production, but the scripts are longer in production. For either development or production, in addition to the sample of previous work, we do allow a second sample, work in progress, but a work in progress is not required for either development or production. But at production, we have to be convinced that a project is ready to go. And in some cases, people have already started production by the time they come in for a production grant to continue work. So these are some of the activities that could be conducted under production. I'm not going to read all the bullets, but basically everything you need to do to make the film and then to promote it and get it out there in the world. We have a ton of examples of recently funded films on our website, but I wanted to highlight a few right now just to give you a sense of what we're looking for, what we fund. Most of the films we fund, as I mentioned earlier, are historical, but there's a real range in terms of that. We have found over the years that biography is really a good way to reach the public with the humanities, compelling stories about individuals. So we fund a lot of biographies. As far as distribution, a lot of the projects and programs that we fund or films that we fund go to public television, but not all of them do. And it's not required that they go to public TV. We've had some that have gone to HBO. We've had some that have gone to streaming services after theatrical runs. So we do require a significant audience for the films. We're putting a lot of money into a project and it's taxpayer funds, so we want to be sure that it's available to as wide a public as possible. So going to more specific examples, we funded The Worlds of Ursula K. Le Guin, which is a biography of the science fiction writer, and that aired on American Masters. All of the examples that I'm going to give during this presentation are all films that were produced by independent producers or directed by independents. The Loving Story later became the basis for the Hollywood movie, but it was a documentary that the NEH funded first about the landmark Supreme Court case that legalized interracial marriage, and this aired on HBO initially, The Loving Story. Adios Amor is a biography of Maria Moreno, a prominent labor organizer whose story had been lost to history. This aired on PBS's Voces series, as did another documentary, more recent documentary on the Cuban writer Jose Molina. We fund lots of films that are not straight biographies also. Hillbilly is about the images of white Southerners in the media, and it touches even on contemporary people and issues and how that history has affected them. Who Will Write Our History is an international project. We do not only fund US projects, we fund international projects on international subjects also. And Who Will Write Our History is a history of the Warsaw Ghetto during the Holocaust and a secret archive there that Jews in the ghetto created to document life in the Warsaw Ghetto. Mr. Soul is about Ellis Hazlip, a popular TV show host, but it goes beyond biography to look really at the cultural history of the TV program and Black culture during the late 60s and early 1970s. So we do fund pop culture projects. We really do fund a range of subjects in the humanities. Radio also, we fund a range of radio programs. We fund a range of podcasts. Many radio programs are distributed through a public radio distributor. And many podcasts have partnerships with other entities, other distributors, other organizations, whether it's the Oxford American Magazine or Linguistics Association, because it is really hard in the podcasting world to distinguish your podcast and get it out there without those kinds of partnerships. Also, you may notice, in addition, just from this brief sample, in addition to history podcasts, there's linguistics, music, philosophy. So we're a little bit more open in terms of subject matter, literature in podcasts. I want to move now to talk a little bit about what's new in media. And these are changes over the last year. We used to have a separate grant program for short documentaries, and we now fund short documentaries under the media program, but we still do fund short documentaries. We've also made a number of changes to both try to shorten and clarify our application to make it easier to apply. And our application, the main application document, is called the NOFO, and I'll be using that term later also. It's Notice of Funding Opportunity, NOFO. And you can find the Notice of Funding Opportunity, which is a very detailed document with all of our guidelines on the media website, which is where you found this webinar also. We've also clarified our rules regarding fiscal sponsors. A fiscal sponsor is a nonprofit organization that's eligible to apply, and the fiscal sponsor frequently partners with the media producer or media director, such as a filmmaker, to submit an NEH application. So the NOFO is very clear about the types of eligible organizations that can apply. We expect fiscal sponsors to contribute to the project, maybe by monitoring the grant, maybe by working with the filmmaker and advising a filmmaker. So look at the Notice of Funding Opportunity very carefully now, because we did make some changes there. It has information on eligibility, and it also very specifically gives examples of some of the kinds of contributions that the fiscal sponsor can make. So take a look at that. It also asks you to describe these contributions in your own explanation in the narrative portion of the proposal. So bottom line is, take a look very carefully at some of those examples. The fiscal sponsor doesn't have to make all of the contributions that we list, but take a look at that, because that's new and it's important as you prepare an application. We accept applications and media twice a year. The next deadline is August 10th, 2022, and then January 11th, 2023. And it's helpful to understand a little bit about the process by which we review proposals. An application comes in and the staff reviews the proposal for minimal eligibility and completeness. We then send it to a peer review panel. Peer review panels are really the heart of the NEH, and feel free to contact either me or Chrissy if you think that you might be interested in serving as a peer review panelist, because peer review panelists are really people like all of you at this webinar. They're filmmakers, they're radio producers, and they're scholars. And they read several proposals, evaluate them, and then meet for really a half-day meeting to discuss the proposals, their strengths and weaknesses, and to make funding recommendations. Based on the peer review panel's recommendations, the staff makes funding recommendations to our National Council on the Humanities. That's a board of 26 people appointed by the president, confirmed by the Senate on a rotating 6-year basis. And by law, the NEH chair, Shelley Lowe, makes final decisions for the agency. So it is a multi-stage process, and it takes several months from the time the application comes in to the time that decisions are released. I have some tips now as far as what does a successful proposal look like, and you could see a bunch of bullet points, but I think what it all adds up to is that the application is a bit of a sales job in that you're looking at the criteria, and we put our criteria, what we're looking for and how we're evaluating proposals in the notice of funding opportunity in the NOFO. Based on these criteria, you want to sell your proposal and sell yourself and get the panelists, the peer review panelists that I just mentioned, excited about the project. They're reading several proposals and you want them to remember yours and get excited about the radio program, the podcast, the film that you'll be making. So these are some tips about how to do that, and what I've seen over time tends to excite the endowment and excite panelists about a proposal. A good story, good subject, strong team of people working on the project, strong distribution plan, potential audience appeal are all very important to us. One of the most important things that you can do, and one of the most common mistakes that people make, is to not look at the resources on our website carefully. Chrissy and I and our colleagues spend a tremendous amount of time making resources available, and it could sometimes take a little while to sort of dig through them, but they really will help with your application. We have sample proposals, we have lists of projects that we funded, we have segments from previous webinars, including some that featured filmmakers that were produced or directed films that were part of, that were funded by the NEH. So, and the notice of funding opportunities. So do take a look at those resources. And also look at the notice of funding opportunity carefully. So for eligibility requirements for the organization that you'll partner with to submit your application. And you're also submitting through grants.gov, which is a government-wide system for submitting applications. So they have rules about registering with SAM and login.gov and stuff that I don't deal with directly, but I know it can sometimes take a while. So if you're working with an eligible organization as a filmmaker, if you're partnering with a fiscal sponsor organization, make sure they have all the paperwork in order and make sure that you're giving yourself enough time to submit the application, because sometimes grants.gov has glitches and you don't want the stress of trying to get in an application either at the last minute or not having all the materials you need. Additional sort of general tips are, and this I think could be useful even for other grant applications, is to ask somebody who's not closely involved with the project to take a look at a draft, see what they think, see if you're hitting some of the points that I mentioned earlier in a successful application. Make sure that you're familiar with the notice of funding opportunity. And after reviewing some of our online resources, you can feel free to contact NEH staff. We are friendly government workers who are here to help you with your projects. We can review drafts of all or part of an application, even if it's, hey, David, or hey, Chrissy, can you look at the humanities themes here and tell me if I'm on the right track? We can tell you if a subject might be competitive at the NEH. Usually, rather than contacting us directly, we ask that queries go through the main Division of Public Programs email address, which is right here, publicpgms@neh.gov. And that helps us sort of assign and streamline projects. So this concludes the formal presentation. Thank you. I will leave this slide up with the contact information for the division. And my colleague Chrissy Cortina and I are glad to take questions through the Q&A box now. Thank you.
Well, there are a couple here. I've answered a few of them in and published those, but someone asked about is a limited liability corporation, an LLC, an eligible organization? And I can take this one, which is that most likely not. Because those are usually for-profit organizations. So an organization has to be a 501(c)(3). So that's the answer to that. Another question maybe you want to take, David, is someone asks, do we measure success in the total number of viewers of a funded work?
Sort of. That's a really good question. That is important to us. As I sort of alluded to a little bit during the presentation, if a filmmaker or an organization is going to get several $100,000 to produce a film, we do want it to find a significant audience. We don't have a significant audience by number, 300,000, 400,000, whatever. Metrics are tricky now across the board anyway, especially for streaming, but we wanted to at least be available to as broad a number of people as possible. One of the reasons that public television has worked well and continues to work well for the NEH is that it has the PBS system at least, has really broad coverage across the country. I think it reaches something like 98% of the population, and the programs are free. So free covering 98% of the country is good. With the industry changing with streaming, it becomes a little bit trickier, but that also makes it incumbent upon the applicant to make a strong argument that the film, because I assume this was a film question or podcast, whatever, will reach a significant audience, that you have partnerships in place, that you understand how distribution works, potentially distribution partners in place. We do not require a distribution commitment at the time of the application. We don't require somebody to say, we will definitely distribute this, even Public TV Program Strand, for example, or anybody else, because that can be hard to get before a film or is produced or while a podcast is still in the development stage. But we do expect you to show that you're knowledgeable. If you have a track record of good distribution, that's helpful. If you have a letter of interest, should the NEH fund this project and should it get produced, it would be a good fit for us. That kind of letter can be helpful. So in a competitive situation, and the NEH is competitive, the more you can show that you meet the criteria and you can get your project out there, the better.
That's a good answer. And I have a question about if you apply in August at our August deadline for, say, development, can you then apply for production at the January deadline? And the answer to that is no, because you can't have applications for the same project under review and also submit another application. So they can't have that overlap. If you are a filmmaker, however, and you have multiple projects going, then you could apply in August and then in January for 2 different projects. Also, David, maybe you want to take this one. Someone asks if we could talk a little bit more about development and production. So if a project receives development funding, how likely is it that the same project that will also be successful in applying for production funding?
Development and production applications are obviously considered at different times because Chrissy just told you can't apply for both at once. If you receive a development grant and then you apply for production, you don't get any preferences for the production application, which sometimes confuses or even frustrates people if they receive a development grant, because there's a feeling, well, if the NEH puts $70,000 into a project and it's progressing okay, shouldn't I have some sort of advantage when I applied for the production grant? And we don't do things that way, in that we really do consider each application independently. The panel considers it independently. That said, we have found that a development grant can really help you do the kinds of things that you need to do to be competitive at the production stage. So we're not formally saying you have an advantage if you get development funding in terms of the decision making, but we have seen a lot of development grants proceed the way we've wanted them to, and receive production funding at a later cycle and as part of a later application. The panel that reviews a production grant won't necessarily know the project history, but if you receive a development grant, you're welcome to mention, we got a development grant, we did all this amazing work, and we're ready for production, and that can be helpful.
Okay, someone else asks, are most podcasts funded also historical, or is the distribution fairly diverse for podcasts? And I would say that it's fairly diverse. I think you had an example. We funded philosophy podcast. We have funded literary, the Oxford American sort of literary podcast. So there is quite a diversity. I would say the one thing that all funded projects have in common are that they work with humanities scholars. Do you want to add to that, David, or?
No, I think that that's a good response. I mean, podcasts are still a little bit tricky because the NEH requires a good amount of information up front. And it's partially, as a federal agency, we really want to know what we're funding up front. And at the same time, we do want to be fairly early money, and even for production. A lot of funders only come in for last money once a project is guaranteed to be completed or even distributed a certain way. We will come in earlier, but the downside to that as an applicant is we require a good amount of information up front, as we discussed earlier. And for podcasts, that could be a little bit tricky because a lot of podcasts really are driven by more spontaneous conversation on a subject. So a lot of the podcasts that have done well have been able to do treatments based on research and based on what they anticipated in the discussion. Sometimes they've actually used archival audio and other materials as part of the application. And history is still probably one of the easier disciplines, humanities disciplines, to script, because it already happened. You know the story, even if you don't know exactly what everybody is going to say or do in your podcast or your film or whatever. So we have funded different kinds of podcasts, but even, for example, Subtitle, which is about language, or the Oxford American Project in partnership with the literary magazine that Chrissy just mentioned, they still tend to do projects either that they can do some research on and give a sense of what the content will be, whether it's more literary history or with Subtitle more linguistics in a way that they could do the research ahead of time.
Excellent. That was a much more detailed and helpful answer, David. We have a question about budget and percentage of budget that I'd actually not exactly sure how to answer. And the question is, I believe that some website building costs could be part of a media projects grant. What percentage of a development or production grant can be budgeted for website costs? And my answer would be that we don't have hard and fast rules. However, I always recommend that the majority of your budget be used to either develop humanities content in the case of development projects, or to really finish producing the film. But that's sort of my answer. I'd love to hear what you think, David.
Yeah, no, I advise people the same way. I think that's a good way to put it, Chrissy.
Well, and again, the most important thing I would say is that we don't have hard and fast rules about percentages of your budget, but that I think is a reasonable thing. Let's see. If our nonprofit already has a track record of producing a radio show or podcast, does our nonprofit need to partner with an outside organization to apply, or can we just go ahead by ourselves? And I can take a crack at this, which is, if you are an eligible nonprofit, so again, a 501(c)(3) nonprofit, it's not required. However, there could be situations where you want to partner with maybe community organizations or other groups that will help either target distribution or help kind of widen your distribution. But again, what do you think, David?
No, I would agree if we don't require that kind of partnership, but I think that's good advice, Chrissy.
Thank you. Let's see. Oh, can you tell us more about the process of sharing a draft application with us? Well, usually, and I don't have the deadline, the application draft deadline in front of me for the August deadline. Do you?
I just worked back 5 weeks from the
Okay.
application deadline. We do post that on our website, though.
Right, we do. So anytime before that deadline, we have a central public programs mailbox. You can submit it there, or you could submit it to a specific program officer. The one thing that I would say is, once one of you, a draft gets sent to one of us program officers, you shouldn't sort of submit a draft to both mailboxes, I guess is what I'm trying to say, because we only have, 7 program officers. And so we really try to make sure that the work is evenly divided, and we don't want to come to the conclusion at some point that 3 of us have read the same draft and sent comments. It's just not fair. So if you could either send it to public programs or send it to an individual program officer, that would be great.
Yeah, I would agree. We are trying to route things a little bit more to the general public programs mailbox, but either way is fine. But we have had trouble with duplicating work, which is messy for everybody. We prefer a Word document, or Word documents as an attachment if you are submitting that draft. And I think I mentioned briefly in the presentation, we can read all or part of it. The draft is there for you. Some funders require a draft almost as a first level of cutoff or of review. That's not how we see it. we see it as an opportunity for you to get some feedback on what is a fairly complicated application process. So again, it could be on just a portion of the project that you're working on, could just be humanities themes, could be the whole thing, could be budget, whatever you feel like both needs the most attention, but also whatever you're able to pull together 5 weeks before the deadline, a staff member will review.
Excellent. Again, much more detailed. There's a question here. Would we have to have a contract with a public television network, or do you, meaning NEH, help with that? The answer to the first question is we don't require a contract. You do, in production in particular, have to lay out a distribution plan. And again, as David said, it's not required that you have a rock solid commitment for broadcast. It would be helpful if you have already started some of those conversations. I would certainly talk about that in your distribution section of your narrative. We don't help make those connections. So really, you should start that process kind of as one of the many activities. I don't know, when do you suggest, David? Almost during development. What do you think?
I think it depends on the project and the subject. It can be tricky, I think, as far as distribution and how early to line that up. And a lot of these are really good questions that in some cases are more case by case basis that Chrissy or I or one of our colleagues can help you with. Yeah.
There's a question, can you apply for a development grant more than once? Does NEH provide feedback on the application? So I mentioned how you can't say submit a development application at one deadline and then submit the same application before you've received any kind of notification from us. So that said, yes. So if you apply in August at the August deadline, you will hear a decision from us by usually early April. With that, you have the option of getting in touch with us after you hear whether your project is being funded or not. You can contact us and ask for the evaluator's comments. So what you'll be sent is all of the evaluations on your projects so that's usually 5 reviewers. And then it's really your decision whether you want to maybe take their suggestions, reshape the project, maybe change it around, and then resubmit. So there's no kind of penalty. There's no kind of, and there's no real, I would say, our reviewers, if you say come in a second time and you weren't funded at the first round, I usually recommend you don't have to say we applied before and this project was turned down for funding. I think one thing that it's always helpful to remember is that reviewers are only going to see what you put into the application. We don't volunteer as staff, any kind of, background on your application. That said, you should also remember that you're probably going to get a whole new set of reviewers. There's a limit on how frequently reviewers can serve for us. There's always at least a 1 year they have to sort of take 1 year off before we can request them. So I always say with those reviewers' evaluations, those comments, you sort of look for kind of common trends, and we are also, as program officers, available to kind of help you sort of sort through the evaluator's comments. Do you want to add anything, David?
No. I think that's good. I mean, I think the big picture is we really take our role as federal workers and civil servants seriously in terms of transparency in the process, in terms of really wanting to help you understand how we make our decisions, and potentially, if you're interested, reapplying or understanding why it might not be worth your time and effort to reapply, depending on the situation.
There's a question about, can projects be in any other language, or is it only in English? And again, I'm kind of interested to hear what David says. Your audience should be primarily US based. Within that, I would say that you can have, say, bilingual films. I think you'd have to make a convincing sort of explanation, rationale for why you're choosing to be bilingual. I can't think of any specific films that, or other media projects that have been entirely not in English. Do you agree, David?
No, I think that's a good way to put it. The application must be in English, and I'm pretty sure in our notice of funding opportunity, in our NOFO, any work sample that you submit needs to have some sort of translation if it's not in English. But we don't have restrictions on the language of the grant product. But again, translation is a good idea. And the Jose Lezama Lima film, for example, that I mentioned, had a fair amount of subtitles and translation there, and that's fine. From
Yes.
Spanish, of course.
And again, in their application, I would imagine that they made a strong sort of case for why that was. And if I recall, they had a lot of archival footage of Lima, who is a poet, reading his own work. So that's kind of one example. Let's see. Looking at the samples, 90% of the media teams had years of PBS documentary experience, Emmy Award winning team members. What are the odds that someone without these accolades will be granted a grant? And I think it's hard to determine odds, but how would you answer that, David?
We fund about 15% of the applications that we receive, which is not a bad funding ratio for a funder in media, if you look at some of the other organizations or just in general. And we do have those two levels of funding, development and production. And sometimes less experienced applicants will come in for development. We want to fund talented filmmakers. We want to fund different voices. We want to fund people who we haven't funded before. And we also want to make sure that the projects really do fulfill our mission to really, get that humanities content, to get really great history films and film, to get really great podcasts in the humanities, radio programs out there. So it is a balance for us, and a lot of times it's on a case-by-case basis, but experience does matter, but it's not the only factor. And people win Emmys, filmmakers win Emmys for a reason, for example. So I don't want to denigrate that, but we do recognize the value and the importance of getting new voices out there too. And even in some of the examples that I gave earlier in the presentation, in several cases, the filmmakers had not received a grant before in the films that I mentioned earlier, or had not received a production grant. The Ursula Le Guin film, the Hillbilly film, for example, Mr. Soul, were all filmmakers who were new to the NEH who received production grants for those films. So it is sort of a mix, and that's the kind of question, do I have the right level of experience, that a program officer can sometimes help you with, but ultimately we do turn to the panel for that kind of advice about the experience and the background of the media producers. And it is a mix of experienced and less experienced people in terms of NEH, but even the less experienced people have frequently made other films or worked on other audio projects elsewhere.
That's excellent. As several people have asked, and I'll just say this again, people have asked about the availability of this webinar. Yes, this is being taped. It will be edited, and probably in about a week, it will be available on the main grant page, which is probably the link you're already familiar with since it's attached to this webinar. It will be closed captioned as well. Someone asked about accessibility. So it will be available and it will be closed captioned. Hopefully that answers the question. Someone else asked about how to connect with NEH scholars, and that's a very good question, and I'll answer and then I'll turn it over to my colleague. There are no specific NEH scholars. We don't have like a pool of people that we think should appear on our projects. They do have to be humanities scholars, so you should certainly have people who are from one of the humanities disciplines. You can have a mixed team depending upon your the subject, the topic of your project. You might, for example, have some historians on as advisors, but also have some tribal elders who are also humanities advisors. So you can have a mix. And then as far as how to connect with them, really you can start at a number of places. One is at your state humanities council. They often have recommendations for people who might be local. I also recommend, if you're doing a project, you certainly should start by doing your research on archaeology or, whatever the main subject of your project is. And then I would recommend looking at some of the scholarship that's available online. You don't have to become an expert, but what you can do is start to identify people whose work might be helpful in advising this project as it gets developed. Most universities and colleges across the country will have short bios of their faculty. You could certainly look there and sort of see what people's interests are, what they've published. And so that's one way of sort of doing connecting with scholars, but there are a lot of other ways as well. David?
No, I think that these are all good tips as far as finding humanities scholars. There isn't an approved list, but a lot of times one or two people will lead you to others in their field. And it's sometimes good to have people who see things differently on an advisory team, not necessarily who vehemently disagree and who've been fighting an academic feud for 30 years or something like that, but people who are asking different questions or approaching the subject a little bit differently can be helpful. We do like different perspectives, especially different legitimate scholarly perspectives. And one of the cool things about the media projects that we fund, and one of the things that we're looking for, are projects that are able to look at a subject, look at a person, look at an event differently and synthesize those different approaches. And again, a lot of times it just starts with one or two scholars. Who else is looking at this, and are they looking at things a little bit differently than the way you are, could even be the kind of question that can help. I'm looking sort of, I was looking at the questions, and I think we have about 5 more minutes, so I can hit a couple of points real quickly, and then, Chrissy, if you saw anything else that we can try to hit quickly, we can maybe do that and
Okay.
make
Well,
ourselves available.
one thing that I will add, someone said, how do I reach out to a program officer? And I would say, especially if we don't answer your question during our time today, go ahead and put it into an email and send it to the public programs email box that is up on screen right now. And what happens is those get routed to individual program officers. So one of us will get back to you, and that way you can avoid duplication. So thanks, we appreciate that.
And I saw somebody asked our names. I'm David Weinstein and Chrissy Cortina.
I'm Chrissy Cortina. Yeah, we are on the website as there's a staff. You can look up the staff section and by division, and you'll see our colleagues as well.
Yeah. I saw another question. Maybe we'll end with this about funding and full funding. I think the question was whether or not full funding has to be in place at the time of the application, or will NEH provide full funding? And the answer is we will fully fund a project. We don't require what we call cost sharing, which is money from other funders. At the same time, we generally do not make the full $700,000 award for production. There are a few projects that have received that, but sometimes we will give you less than is requested. So it is helpful if you have other sources of funding lined up. And another important thing is that we will not release NEH's funds that are awarded to the project until you have all the funds that you need to make the film or the podcast. So again, we will fund 100% of the cost of a project. We find it is advantageous if you can bring other money to the project, and we will not release our money if you plan to bring other money to the project until you confirm that money, which may be a little bit too detailed or in the weeds, but it's in our notice of funding opportunity, and one of us can sort of explain that if there's a follow-up question or an issue in a one-on-one conversation. So thank you, Chrissy. Were there any last minute questions in the next minute or two that you saw that we should address, or?
Well, here's one. A lot of the questions remaining are more detailed. One is, can you still be considered eligible for development funds if you've already started capturing footage and interviews? And the answer is yes. And in fact, you should have developed, really made connections with scholars, fleshed out your media team, and oftentimes filmmakers have already started, say, interviewing people. So that's fine. It's not absolutely required, but I do think it might even strengthen your project.
Yeah, the line between development and production can be tricky, and that again is something that we could guide you on, but I thought that was a really helpful description, Chrissy. Thank you. And with that, I will thank you all for attending. Thank you all for your questions. You know where to find us. We hope that you're interested in applying. We hope that we can help you. And we wish you luck with your media projects. Thank you.
Yes, thank you for tuning in this afternoon.
Bye-bye.